When I look at the ministry of Jesus there, and if we're going to model our ministry and our leadership after the ministry of Jesus, there is an element of pace that Jesus elevates over and over and over again. Every time you see the crowds grow, you immediately see Jesus withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The crowds don't grow, right? He preaches, he does miracles, and he does all this stuff, but then he never says, all right, we got to go do more. He withdraws.
Hey, welcome to the Valor Vision Podcast. I'm really excited about this one. It's been kind of a long time coming as we were talking about getting Pastor Dan in here. He's our lead pastor over at Illuminate Church. And so we're trying to get the scheduling and everything all put together. And as we're getting closer to Easter and everything, it's been all over the place. But so I'm really excited about this because you have no idea. I mean, I've expressed this to you, how much personally you've been such a godsend to me in a time that I think was divinely appointed, you reaching out and everything and us connecting together. But let me read a bio for Pastor Dan here as we get into it. Today's guest is Dan Pitman, a church planner, a lead pastor of Illuminate Church in Southern New Jersey. With nearly 2 decades of ministry experience, Dan has served across worship, youth, and pastoral leadership, bringing a well-rounded and deeply relational approach to ministry. He holds a bachelor's in worship theology and leadership from Grand Canyon University and a master's of divinity from Wesley Seminary. He is passionate about helping people encounter real hope, growth in their faith, and experience authentic community. Dan's heart is for building life-giving churches that reach those who feel somewhat disconnected from traditional church environments and creating spaces where faith is approachable, meaningful, and lived out daily. He is also deeply invested in leadership development and helping churches think critically and creatively about ministry in today's culture. And beyond all of that, Dan is also a devoted husband and father and a dear friend. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here, Nick.
And so tell us about, we got the Masters of Divinity, we got all the titles, we got all the experience, but who is Dan? How did little Dan grow up and family and all of that?
Yeah, so I grew up in church. I grew up in a church family, I would say. My grandfather was a pastor first in the United Methodist Church, but then transitioned and became pastor in the Assembly of God Church. My uncle was a pastor. My dad has worked in church in a volunteer capacity really all my life. So I grew up under that setting from a family sense. But I would say that really didn't take hold for me personally from a faith perspective. Really, I would almost say into my late teens, early 20s. In fact, I would go as far to say as when I started to work in churches from a ministry perspective, I probably wasn't saved yet.
Mm-hmm.
That I just had a skill set, particularly in music at the time, that was desirable and needed. And so I got put on a platform when I was leading things I didn't even believe yet. And then it took me a while to wrestle with those things and eventually come to an understanding and come to a belief and come to work out some of the tension of the hypocrisy that we see in church sometimes and how I would interact with that took some time to wrestle through, I would say.
About what age are we talking about here?
That was my late teens, early 20s. So I started to work in ministry kind of formally at 16 is when I got elevated and started to lead worship at a church at 16 years old. There regularly started in a Saturday night service and then extended into Sunday mornings there shortly after as the contemporary movement kind of really swooped through the area. But like I said, at that point, faith wasn't even something that was my own yet. It was an occupation there. And so it took some time until those two things really became something that I would consider to be mine, right? The occupation and the giftings that God had given me, but also a faith that I could grasp and understand on my own.
Would you say it was kind of more of a slow burn for you to kind of coming into faith and Christ being your savior, not just a savior kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of how I would describe it. Is a slow burn with like a moment of clarity. I remember clearly I was leading at this retreat weekend. I used to lead a lot of retreats and conferences from a worship perspective. And I was leading at this retreat weekend. And I remember clearly this speaker came out and preached just a tremendous message. And it was this interesting scenario where backstage in the green room, so to speak, I was having this moment of clarity of accepting Christ as I was going out to lead worship over people who were accepting Christ. It was a very interesting thing. And it was like, yeah, I really believe this.
It's almost like that moment was also just for you too.
Yeah.
As very much instead of I'm ushering in we think of this when we're doing ministry and we step on stage and we're preaching and leading worship, that it's for everyone else. And I think sometimes we forget that those moments are for us too.
Yeah. And I think, the deepest worship you experience, I think, from a congregational perspective, is led by somebody who is deep in worship themselves. So, in those moments, it's so important, I think, just to grasp and take hold of those things, because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this so easy to just begin checking boxes. Right.
Yeah.
Of this is the next thing I have to do. This is the next thing I have to do. And I think ministry and really leadership in general can become all about checking boxes, and we lose the heart behind it all when the connectivity, the community, the passion really flows from the heart, not the task.
Right. Like one of the big things is, we come into, when we get into leadership and we get into like we're stepping into these roles of leadership, you have like an initial idea of what leadership is all about and how to operate in that. Talk to us about how that originally was your vision versus how did that change over time, and what experiences really kind of morphed where you stand now for leadership.
I think there are two big things that change that. Number one is just kind of experience and longevity has really shaped my leadership outlook a lot in working in different environments and big churches, small churches, but working in those environments and seeing the pace and the effect of that. And seeing that, like, the price that was paid for the excellence word that we tend to throw around and use, that price wasn't always one that you saw up front. Sometimes it was one that you saw 6 or 8 months down the line, as some of the most talented people I've worked with in ministry are out of ministry because they just got burnt out so bad. And so that really shaped my leadership outlook there. And then the other was honestly kind of some traumatic situations. I was kind of thrust into senior leadership through a difficult church situation. I didn't really have a desire to be in senior leadership at the time. I was working as an associate pastor someplace, and things got sketchy and hairy, and the lead pastor resigned and left and went to another church, and I was kind of elevated quickly there. It was a really interesting time because I had actually interviewed and was about to take a position with another church there when she left, and it was like, oh, I gotta stay now. And that situation led us to church plant there. But I think through that, I learned so much about what kind of leader I didn't want to be. And that really helped shape the leader I am today there, where, man, sometimes we look at good leaders and we're like, oh, I want to be like that. And yes, that's true. But I think sometimes we look at leaders who are ineffective and you're like, oh, man, I don't want to be like that. And that can be even more helpful in some ways.
I've found that a lot, definitely through my military experience as well, of running into bad leaders or leaders that are more about themselves than really anything else, and all sorts of different areas, and that how that translated even into ministry. But leadership, I think, takes different forms in the setting that it's in, because clearly a military style is mission absolutely comes first. There's some deep critical stuff. It's very time sensitive for certain things like that. But ministry is it's more of a marathon type operation. It is not. I mean, we have little metrics and marks where it's like, hey, we got to get Christmas done. We got to get Easter done. Right. But overall, ministry is this long, slow marathon like process, which leadership then looks different in that context versus a quick military operation that we have to get going. And then we can like pull back once the mission's been accomplished. Has that kind of, shaped a little bit for you of just seeing this, as you talked about, somebody leaving the ministry because they just got burned out and that marathon kind of pace?
Yeah, I think for me, there's 4 P's that I always think about in my like leadership evaluation, and that's pace, people, performance, and platform. And I think we have to have those 4 P's in the right order to do effective ministry and really to just do effective leadership in general. When we start to elevate one of those P's and they start to come out of order there, it changes and it affects the other ones. For example, if we start to elevate platform,
Mm-hmm.
right, then we judge ourselves just exclusively based on our performance. If we're elevating platform, and we do that at the expense of pace and people.
Yeah.
And so there's this balance there of, well, if we elevate, people too much or pace too much, well, then like the performance can suffer. And so there's this tension between those 4 Ps. I think that we're always trying to wrangle and always trying to balance the scales there of, man, how's my pace? Right? How's my performance? Like, how's the platform for me? Is, am I keeping my ego in check on the platform side? And then the last one is like, how am I caring for people? And I think those 4 Ps together really help shape that marathon of ministry, so to speak, and if we're aware of those things, it really helps us to put things in perspective.
Yeah. You hit on something right there, is keeping your ego in check. Talk to us about how that kind of works for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's one of the trends. I'll start with this, like we see in ministry and really leadership and in our culture and world in general, is we see in our culture, right, everybody seems to be searching for platform, especially in leadership. You're almost only as effective as your platform is the way we view things there. And so what that has led to is just a culture in the church and a culture in general where we tend to want to self-elevate, right? Man, I put myself up front. I put myself up front there, right? I'm the face of the church, or I'm doing this, or I have this side project and this side project and this side project. And everybody needs to see me. And I think it's extremely detrimental to an organization in general there, because what it does is it makes a person the platform of the organization there. And so I think a much healthier model, what we try to emulate in our church context, is to pour into different leaders, right, to share the platform. And for me, that helps keep my ego in check, because I'm not on the platform. I'm not even on the platform most of the time anymore. Like there's 52 weeks in a year. We do church 51 of those weeks. I think this year I preach 20 of those weeks, maybe 21. So like, I'm not even on the platform most of the time. And that helps keep my ego in check there, because I'm pouring into other people. I'm elevating other people. And so out of, taking that P of people, or out of elevating that, it helps keep the platform in check. And I also would say, when we keep our egos in check and we keep our platform in check, and we're not trying to platform ourselves, one of the side effects of trying to platform ourselves is we tend to spread ourselves thin, because we feel like we have to have a hand in everything. When we stop trying to platform ourselves, our performance actually tends to grow, because we can focus better on the task at hand.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I've personally, working there and being a part of this, considering not just my recent church context, but my whole life context, I think of military and everything, it has been really, really amazing to see this balance get played out of Shaq preaching some, you preaching some, the grace of you giving me time to have up there and grow in that area, and Karen and everybody. I think that just really, and we see so much from the congregation as well, enjoying different voices, different, it's the same message, but at a different glance, right? By the way that how Shaq brings it and how you bring it and all of that coming into different areas. And so it's literally elevating what God is doing in the church versus what Dan wants to do in the church, kind of thing. And it really comes out well. You talked also about, making sure that we don't elevate people too much, because then if we overly do that, then certain standards start falling down. Where do you find that balance? Because, also you get the reverse of that. Standards are so high, and then people feel unseen, uncared about, and unworthy, and like nothing is ever good enough, type thing. Where do you see that balance?
Yeah, so I think it just is a balance, right? It's a constant, adding beans to both sides of the scale to make that balance there, because you're right. If performance becomes, right, the P that we elevate most, then people feel unseen, people get frustrated, people get discouraged there. But if people become, the P that we elevate above all else, then performance can start to suffer, because our attention can shift as a leader, right, from the practical needs of the organization to the practical needs of an individual, which is in a leadership context, it can be equally as damaging there. So it's just this balance. What I tend to do is, and I think if we're talking from a leadership aspect, it's helpful to put people around you to understand your strengths and weaknesses and know you can't do it all.
Yeah.
And so to put people around you who can do those things. So for example, in my giftings is actually not dealing with people. Right? I'm a better organizational leader than I am a pastor of people. And so in our team, we have people who surround me who do that part of our ministry so that we're still caring for people. We're still taking care of people, but at the same time, we've got somebody who's focused on, the performance aspect and making sure that we're keeping those things balanced. I would say the biggest struggle is in pace.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's where I think the biggest tension is in this balance of performance and people is in pace, because sometimes we feel like we have to go so fast to perform bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But the sacrifice we make on the altar of performance is almost always people.
Mm-hmm.
So that understanding the pace and really just observing and saying, hey, if we do this, it's going to affect these people this way, and thinking those things through, I think helps us become more effective in caring for people while we're focused on performance.
Is the juice worth the squeeze type thing?
Yeah.
Always looking at like, hey, is burning the staff worth this effort of doing XYZ? And sometimes it is. Sometimes we've had surge moments where it's like, hey, everyone, buckle your seatbelt, like it's Christmas, right? Or whatever.
But we want to do this fun event on a Friday night, and it's going to take 25 volunteers to do, and we need all of our kids min team on board to do that. And you look at him like, yeah, we're going to do this event. And sure, it could be cool, but now we're asking our kids min team to be here Friday night and Sunday and serve again on Wednesday night. Yeah, let's probably not do that to them and put them in that position.
Yeah, because they're already, usually in most churches, the kidsmen individuals, all those kids ministry volunteers are the most strained of a lot of them. Them and the worship team, depending on your depth on that one. But kids ministry is definitely, that's always like, no, what are we going to do here? So I think one of the other things is, how do you recognize when talking about people more? Sometimes it's, leaders almost forget about potentially as somebody getting burned out, as somebody getting to a point where they need to take a break or a step back or get refreshed in some way. How do you recognize it before they even come to you and go, I'm burned out, like this is too much?
I think one of the ways there is, if it becomes part of your culture to have natural breaks and resting periods, it allows you to evaluate what's going on around you a lot easier. If your pace is so fast, and I love, right, Carey Nieuwhof talks about, like, if you're in a busy season that has lasted more than a year, it's not a season anymore. You just have a busy life, right? If your pace has become that fast, it is so hard for you to stop and evaluate what's going on around you and honestly see the people who are going on around you. So I think evaluating that with other people starts with getting your pace right and understanding, like, hey, if I'm taking care of myself so I don't burn out, then I can begin to see if other people are starting to burn out there. And so I think it starts with that, but then just looking for the signs, like, am I running this person through the ground week after week after week after week? Like, even if they're not showing signs of burnout now, understanding that if I continue to do that, that is going to be the outcome. And so at some point, and I think it's hardest if you're leading people who always say yes. We've got a few of those on our team who, like, if I ask, they will say yes, I will do that. And so part of how you protect them from burnout is not asking there, right? Not giving them opportunities, right? Withholding opportunities that you could give them there and choosing to do something else because you understand they are already doing X and Y and Z. And if I ask for, A, B, and C, they're going to do that too, right? They're going to say yes. They're going to do those things too. And so how do I protect them from burnout? I just don't ask them to do those things.
Yeah. So I'm one of them. But I think the other part of all of this is is the whether you recognize it or not, and I think you do, but there's a culture that also you can say no.
Yeah.
Like if
Yeah.
somebody actually says that's too much for me, like it's okay to say that, because there's cultures out there where it's like if the big man walks in and says we're going to do this, there's no, you turn around and say no, it becomes a problem.
Yeah. And I think, again, that all speaks to pace. When you create a culture where pace becomes the priority, those other things just follow. Right. Because I think our team understands that we value pace. And so if the pace quickens and it's too much, you can say that it's too much because we don't value, right, platform or performance or one of those other P's kind of above everything else, where if I value performance more than anything and I ask you to do something and you say no, like I light my hair on fire. Where like if I value platform there and I ask you to do something that helps platform me more, well, then like you just become a tool to like a means to my end there. And so like I get very upset there. But if pace becomes the thing that we prioritize the most, then it helps us just fall into line of, hey man, like this is too much for me right now in this season. And I can say, all right, is it affecting our performance? If it's not, then I can give some grace to like back off there.
Yeah. Kind of shifting a little bit more towards, we're all human, right? Leaders are still human, whether you recognize it or not. And sometimes we forget that certain people are human because they may be just a phenomenal leader and a phenomenal person, and we always hold them like a little bit higher than some others, but there's still internal struggles. There's still internal, am I doing the right thing? That second guessing yourself and things like that. And fear jumps in to, man, am I going to push them too hard? And whatever the case may be of making those decisions, how do you kind of handle that internally on your own internal mind, which I know you're like me, we're both very hard on ourselves internally a little bit. And so what are the mechanisms that kind of help you center yourself a little bit, if you will?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. Number one, I think it is so important to surround yourself with friends and just a circle of like-minded leaders who you can go to and say like, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm wrong, who are going to support you, but also call you out and tell you when you're wrong.
Mhm.
I often say like in our context on our leadership team, one of my favorite people on that team will tell me all the time, like, Dan, I will never in a meeting publicly disagree with you, but that person will call me directly afterwards and say, hey, you were out of line. You need to get that together there. And it's so important to have those people to hold you accountable. And that's one piece of that. I think the other piece, and I'm just going to keep coming back to pace because I think it matters so much here, is as you're self-evaluating, I'll put it this way. When I look at the ministry of Jesus there, and if we're going to model our ministry and our leadership after the ministry of Jesus, there is an element of pace that Jesus elevates over and over and over again. Every time you see the crowds grow, you immediately see Jesus withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The crowds don't grow, right? He preaches, he does miracles, and he does all this stuff, but then he never says, all right, we got to go do more. He withdraws, right? Yeah. The pressure comes, he prays. And so there's this pace that comes over and over again. And so as we as leaders are focused on ourselves and evaluating ourselves and, right, did I do the right thing here? If performance again becomes that driving factor there, then we become critical of ourselves based on the metric of performance because it's all that we have. If we elevate pace in those situations and self-evaluation there, then I start to evaluate myself and I can take a step back and say, all right, that went wrong. Why did that go wrong? What can I do about that? Am I really called to do this right now?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the model we see Jesus emulate in his ministry over and over again, that every time, right, as you read the Gospels time and time and time again, when the pressure builds from a leadership perspective, Jesus withdraws and he prays and he resets and then he goes again.
Yeah, because the pressure is there that if there's more and more people in the bigger crowd, then there's that voice from the crowd that ultimately says, we want more.
We want more. And if we circle back to the ego, right? Right. As the crowd grows, as there's more and more and more people, I start to value performance. I start to value platform there. And so I just think it's this intentional rhythm that we have to create there of, hey, I'm going to value pace in this moment. That like as the pressure builds, I'm going to hold pace above all else because right, pace allows me to work through things in a healthy manner.
Yeah. I think ministry leadership, another area that it's so different than leadership in so many different areas of life is that there's the explicit part of faith, and we have faith. And then I think, unfortunately, a lot of leadership talk in the church, sometimes I hear lack of where does faith step in? Where does faith, interjected into how we operate as leaders versus you got to have an answer all the time. And sometimes faith is about not always having your answer, but God's answer.
Yeah. And again, I think that there's a balance there too. I've worked in environments where I'll take like budget, for example.
Mhm.
Right? I've worked in an environment where like we bring in, $200,000 and they want to pass a budget that's $500,000 and they say, oh, the Lord will provide, right? We have faith, the Lord will provide. And you're like, well, like, but that's just not going to work, right? We have the same number of people here this year as we have last year, and they had the same jobs they had last year. And right, how's that going to happen? And so I don't think we're called to lead that way, but I also don't think we're called to have to try and figure it all out on our own. There is that faith element in leadership. And I think that's true if you're leading in a church. But I think if you're a Christian and you're leading outside of a church, right, there's a faith element in your leadership as well. There to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. One of the wonderful things about Christianity is this admitting that happens right from the outset that we don't have it all figured out.
Right.
And I think as a leader, that's incredibly free.
Yeah.
There to understand that like, hey, in my very DNA, right, the faith at the very core of me says, Dan, you don't have it all figured out all the time. And so as a leader, I don't have to pretend to have it figured out all the time. I can say, hey, I messed up. Hey, I get things wrong, right? But at the same time, I can say there's a place that I can go when I don't know what to do, right? And that's through faith and in prayer, and start to seek wise counsel and do those things. And that begins to shape how you lead.
It's because it's like, man, there's always that tension of like people always look at you as the leader to have that answer, to have that figured out, to have, and it's like, well, we're just gonna have some faith on that. And sometimes that's not what people want to hear.
It's not. So I would actually say most of the time it's never what people want to hear. Most of the time they never want to say like, we don't know how that's going to work yet. But I also think, and we're seeing this shift in our culture in general, honesty and authenticity is being valued far more than it has in a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is also the way you gain somebody's trust as a leader, is to say something when you don't know, and to say like, hey, I don't know how this is going to work out, but we have faith that it's going to one way or the other. The other thing I would put on that is from a leadership perspective, allowing yourself to at times not have an agenda that you're pushing. I think sometimes as leaders, we push our agenda and then put God's name on it there. And so like in those moments, we don't know, especially that temptation can creep in to say like, hey, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'd like it to work out like this. And so I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it works out that way. And then I'm going to say that was God's plan. Where I think if we're leading from a faith perspective, again, it's that pace. Let's stop, let's rest, let's pursue God, let's pray on that. And let's actually allow him the time to reveal his will to us, rather than come off with some half-cocked plan that we try to put his name on.
Yeah. Can you think of a time wherever you were like, hey, we planned this, it got totally jacked up, but honestly, God's plan came through in it, and it actually worked out very well, but just totally not how Dan wanted it?
Yeah. So the whole story of our church is that.
We live it every day.
Right, I didn't want a church plant. Actually, our leadership team had approached me months before we decided to plant the church, and to see if I was willing to plant. And I said, no, that's not what I want to do. And then the conversation came up again like 6 months later. And I said, all right, well, like reluctantly, we'll do that. And so as we began that process, that process began and we began to search for a location. And I said in the first vision planning meeting, hey, I don't want to be in the town of Woodstown. That's the town we were coming from. It was just too messy for me. And I don't want to be in a school, right? Churches that start in schools have problems getting out of schools a lot of time. You get locked there because you never really outgrow the facility. And there's some things as we looked and we looked and we looked and we looked for a facility for about 10 months. And we just couldn't find anything that was going to work. And then Woodstown High School fell into our lap. It was the place we didn't want to be, right? Geographically, in the town we didn't want to be in the type of facility we didn't want to be in. And so we planted, and for the first year and a half of Illuminate, we did church in Woodstown High School. And then as that went on there, we started to look for what a permanent facility was going to look like for us. And we said, again, we had a vision meeting and said, hey, we want to be, in a warehouse and something trendy and cool. And like, man, we definitely don't want a church building, right? That's not us. And we looked and things were just out of our price range. And then we had a group approach us and said, hey, would Illuminate ever consider making our church building your home? It's free. And we looked and we evaluated and we said, yeah, this is where God is calling us to be. And I'll be honest, even in that process, as we went through that, I was not on board, and our leadership team would tell you I was not on board with the move into the church building up until like the 11th hour there, when I finally kind of signed off on it, because it just wasn't my plan. It's not what I wanted, and God kind of came in and he said, well, like, your plans are jacked. We're going to do this instead. And as soon as we moved into that church building, the church exploded. And growth started to happen super rapidly. And it became so clear to us what we were called to be in that moment as a church, instead of what we were trying to be before that.
Right. Because I know through that also, you're getting voices from other people, you're getting ideas from other people, you're getting like what they think they want. And in this specifically in ministry, because then it's also, you're taking time out to sit down and try to hear the voice of God and what does God want to do and speak to you. But then you have leaders and elders and other volunteers and all this coming at different angles. What is your filter process to know, okay, no, that's not it. Wait, you know what? God could be speaking through somebody else to me right now.
Yeah. So part of it for me, and I'm not saying this works for everybody, I'm just saying I've found that this works for me, is I keep a very tight and close circle. And so there are a lot of, as you move into senior leadership, whether it's in a church or just organizational leadership in general, there's a lot of people who will kind of fight for your attention. There's a lot of feedback that comes at you, and how you have to learn to filter that feedback. For me, is I keep a very tight circle of honest people around me who really have my ear. And so when feedback comes from somebody who is outside of that circle, I kind of wait till I'm starting to hear those same things from people who are inside that circle there, because I know that they don't come to me with every little thing, right? But when the guy who is the steady hand at the wheel, I've got one of those in my circle, I call him the steady hand. He's slow to react. He spends time, he evaluates things. When he comes to me and says, hey, Dan, I think we have a problem here, I listen, my ears, press in, I lean in, my attention peaks, because if he's going to say we have a problem, right, it's something I actually need to address. Where if the squeaky wheel, right, the person who comes to you every Sunday and says, I don't like this and I don't like this and I don't like this, well, like that just becomes white noise. And like you
Right.
kind of filter that out. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes they aren't valid complaints.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is, as a leader, you have to learn how to filter those
Yeah.
complaints. And for me, the process that's worked is to have a circle around me who really have my attention and really have my ear there. But those people have to be people who can be honest with you. They can't be yes men.
Yeah.
There,
That's
right? If
it.
you put yes men around you, all you're going to get is yes answers. And that becomes extremely detrimental as a leader.
Mhm.
If you put people who respect you, but are honest with you and will call you out on things around you, then you can go to them when you're struggling and they can hold you up. But when you think everything's going fine and it's not, they can hold you accountable.
Yeah. But they do it in a loving way.
Yes.
They do it in a way that's like not trying to point fingers, but they actually want to hold hands with you and do it together kind of thing, which I think is huge. because we live in a culture that's all about pointing fingers. And it's like, if all you're going to do is point fingers and you're not going to willingly walk with me, yeah, that's all. That would me already be a filter. But I love how you're kind of like, hey, confirmation needs to come from this. If it comes from somebody outside of that, and then the circle also is saying that, that's that confirmation of, yep, we need to listen to that.
Yeah. And I would also, if we circle back to culture there, I use the language, it's something I picked up in my youth days, a lot of earning the right to be heard, right? So if I am coming to you and like every time I approach you is just like, Nick, you're doing this wrong. Nick, you're doing this wrong. Nick, you're doing this wrong. Like, Nick, I need more from you here. Like, number one, all I'm doing is beating you down as a leader. But like, number two, I haven't earned the right to be heard on any of that, because like, as soon as you see me, there's this negativity that like swells inside of you.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what did I do wrong now? If as leaders we can create the culture where the cultures of our organization is to lift people up, the culture of our organization is to prop people up, to encourage people, it holds so much more weight when we have to come with correction.
Yeah.
Right. Because then it becomes like, hey, if our interactions are mostly like, hey, Nick, thank you, you're doing such a good job here. Like, Nick, like, I love how you're doing this there. And then I come with you like, hey, Nick, I need you to get a little bit better in this area. It holds more weight because I don't always come at you like that, And so I think as leaders, right, that's part of that elevating people that we have to understand there, that sometimes the best way to get to better performance is not by chasing performance. It's by holding hands with somebody and saying, hey, like, I want to see you get better, and I'm going to pour into you and support you and love you through that.
Yeah. I think one of the things that a lot of leaders sometimes forget, that at least I've seen this in my experience in multiple contexts, is they'll say, I need you to get better at XYZ, but then they never give suggestions on how. Like, right. They go, hey, do better at that. How?
Yeah, ask
do better.
Right.
Right. And it's just like, do better. And like, but how? Like, cause I'm doing what I know how to do. And if you need to get better at it, then is there a course? Is there something, depending on what it is? And a lot of leaders sometimes don't go into that. And that becomes where leadership is real leadership. You're leading them into a better, whatever it is that they need to get better at, or work on or whatever. And that's the holding out the hand versus just pointing the finger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Type thing. And here it's like getting back into the faith part of leadership here as well. It's encouraging the faith of everyone around us as well, because not forgetting that this is an organization that has faith built into it. Not to say that other organizations can't have that in it, but of course that's what church is all about, right?
We're centered on faith. We're like, if you're leading, like a nonprofit, well, like, you may not be centered on faith, but faith can be certainly like a driving force in your organization.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Or even in the workplace environment.
Yeah. A lot of nonprofits that are Christian based and things like that. That's a big faith organization. But church in itself is specifically designed to grow people's faith. Right. And so how do you also infuse that to make sure that, hey, let me make sure that somebody is on the right track in their faith internal to the organization, so we can do that for the congregation?
So I think again, I'm just going to keep circling back, right, to those P words there, because how we prioritize them matters so much. If we create an organization that values performance, what we say to people who are sitting in the chairs or sitting in the pews there is, to be a Christian or to be a good enough Christian, you have to do better there, right? So if our organization values performance, that bleeds through. There, and our people think that, all right, well, in order to be a Christian, like, Nick is a Christian or Dan is a Christian, well, then I have to perform at the level that they do. There. And so I think how we run our organizations matter in that way, where, if we see, or if people can see an organization behind the scenes that cares for people the way Jesus cared for people, that prioritizes, pace the way Jesus prioritized pace. Right. I think one of the most powerful testimonies we can have is when people actually see us do what we talk about.
Yeah.
And so, like, as leaders, if people can see us pray when we're under pressure, when they become under pressure, they'll pray.
Yeah.
And so the culture that we set matters so much, because leading a healthy organization allows us to grow healthy disciples, right, for Christ under that banner there. if we start to prioritize the wrong things, in turn, the people who we encounter will begin to prioritize, those things as well. If we prioritize platform, for example, then the knock on people will begin to think, oh, I can't share my faith because I don't have enough platform to do so. Where if we prioritize people, then we begin to understand that, man, the gospel moves at the speed of relationship.
That's big.
And so the way we lead matters so much in just how we carry out those things.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of times we lead in a certain way and then we think we can also mask it so it doesn't bleed out, but unfortunately it does, whether
Yeah.
you want to do or not, kind of thing. I think here's the hard question. Here's the question that when you're in leadership, you hate this. This is like every leader. I've never met a leader that enjoys doing this, but having those hard conversations with people that are underperforming or severely mess up or whatever. How do you handle the difficult, man, this is not going to be a good day for me kind of conversations?
Well, my first thing is I always try to have a third party in the room that can interpret, because I think a lot of times when you enter into those conversations as a leader, you can enter into those conversations from a place of frustration. And that doesn't help anybody. If I'm just speaking out of my frustration, it doesn't actually help you get any better.
Yeah.
There. And what it's actually going to make you do is become extremely defensive about what you did that I didn't like. So having a third party in the room is really, I think, the first step to doing those conversations well, or just better than we are right now. There, because it allows us to filter, some things. And the next thing I would say is that, man, as we're having those conversations, listen and have grace there. Grace is not the absence of accountability. Right? Accountability and grace can happen at the same time. What I would say is accountability holds somebody to a standard. Grace says, hey, you didn't meet that standard this time, but you can try again. And so now there are going to be situations, right, where they're a little bit more serious and maybe we can't try again. But if we actually listen to try to understand why and have grace in those moments, 95% of those conversations I've had, the person didn't have malice in their heart when they carried those things out. That didn't go well. Right. There's a reason why they did the things the way. And like, maybe that reason isn't very good. Right. I've experienced those of like, well, like, all right, I did it this way because, and you're like, well, that's stupid. Why'd you do that? Right. Like, I've had those conversations there, but I very, very, very rarely have ever had those conversations where somebody said, I did it this way because my intention was to harm the organization.
Yeah, no.
And so, just trying to understand where those things are coming at as a leader, I think just becomes so valuable. And again, that's how we get to better performance, by elevating or prioritizing people, is we just begin to listen there. Right? It's not that we don't correct. It's not that we don't hold them accountable. It's just that we offer some grace along the way, that we begin to understand how those things work and they happen along the way. And you're right. Those conversations are no fun. They suck. But trying to get to a place where we're not just having those conversations from a place of our frustration, and we're actually having a dialogue, makes them so much easier.
Yeah.
I think on both parties.
And sometimes that leads into recognition that really what it is hey, somebody's not gifted in a certain area, and we keep trying to put them in an area that they're ungifted, right? But they're gifted in other areas. And then so I always seen that as, hey, how do I leverage the strengths and weaknesses of everyone to put them in the right spots to make the organization great and them feel valued as well. But what is some of your criteria of being able to evaluate somebody in that, and maybe even recognizing potential that they don't even recognize in themselves and putting them in a spot for that to highlight?
Yeah. So I think as a church leader, but this stretches outside of just church leadership, people are always most effective when they're operating in their spiritual gifts and their passions. If we can get those things to align, that's when we're going to get the most out of somebody there. And so I think we fail to ask that question often enough. Like, hey, Nick, what are you passionate about? I remember when we sat down and really had that conversation early on, you started talking about men's ministry and like, oh, I'm passionate about raising, disciples, right, that are men, that are heads of households there. And the response becomes like, hey, come do that here. Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
right. Just come do that here. Because if we can align your spiritual gifts and your passions, man, that's when we're going to get you to run on all 7 cylinders,
Yeah.
or all 8 cylinders. It's when we start to prioritize performance and checking boxes, that's when we get in trouble. Because if I write a job description that says you have to do X and Y and Z, and you're not good at any of those things, and I said, but this is the job description, right? Fill it. Well, like, you're going to struggle. And then I'm going to be thinking, oh man, Nick's really struggling. Why? Well, because I gave him stuff to do that he's not very good at,
Yeah.
And so I think as a leader, it's
He hates his life
Right.
every day.
like, why? Like, for me, I am not, like a pastoral care visitation person. And so if I had to do that nonstop, I'd be miserable, right? And because it's not my spiritual giftings, that's not the way God has gifted me. Now, God has gifted some other people in our context in those things in a tremendous way.
Mhm.
And so, like, I'm so grateful that we have different giftings, because it allows me to focus on the nuts and the bolts and the behind the scenes stuff that God has gifted me in. In understanding how to make the organization run. But as we're looking at somebody, I think that's where we have to start as a leader. If you're evaluating somebody, is, hey, what are they passionate about and how has God gifted them? And if we can see those two things, to your point of, man, sometimes we see potential in somebody that they don't even see yet. If I can see, like, hey, like, you have a passion for this, but you don't think you're good enough to do it, but I see these spiritual giftings that you have,
Mhm.
and those giftings press into that or lean into that, then I can begin to pour into you and start to elevate you in that
Yeah.
way, and start to say, like, hey, you are good enough, right? Like, look at how God has gifted you there. And so that's where I just think we have to get better, honestly, as the capital C church, is understanding the way we use people. I took my capstone class in seminary. I had to read this book called Pastor's Public Theologian, and I disliked it greatly because it described the pastor as having to be a holy jack of all trades.
Yeah.
And I just thought to myself, like, no, 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 no. This is how we have gotten in trouble as a church, right? Is we have asked pastors to do things they are not spiritually gifted to do, instead of looking at their spiritual giftings and said, hey, you're good at this, you do this. Let's find somebody who's good at the things you're not good at and bring them in to assist in those areas, rather than you just try to do it all, even though God hasn't gifted you to do it all.
Right. And then there's I think there's a big underlining part in this as well, as we see a lot of people that maybe thinking as they grow in their faith is ministry for me, and go, well, I don't want to go sit at people's bedside at a hospital. I don't want to sit down. I don't want to perform weddings for people. I don't want to do funerals. I don't want to do all those
I don't
things.
want to preach and be on the platform, right?
Right. Hate public speaking, like whatever those things are. And then you go, I guess ministry's not for me. And I think that there's also a level of like, hey, for you out there, if you have a heart for your faith, God will have spiritual gifts that will align somewhere in the church. Because how do you think a church operates without the organizational development behind it? How do you think the church operates in our world without the financial working through it and making sure that feel good, loves to hug everyone pastor isn't like spending all his money on all this stuff, and we got to rein things in and keep it balanced and stuff? And so we need those kind of people in ministry just as much. And so
when we look at the description of, right, the body of Christ, the church is the body of Christ. Not one person is every piece of the body. And so what I would say from an organizational leadership side, is that there is a growth cap to your leadership with your giftings, unless you start to surround yourself with people who have different giftings there. So, like, from a church planter context, I'm gifted to be a church planter, to get a church off the ground. Why? Because I understand the organizational side really well. I understand what we need to get off the ground. I understand how to make it go from the business aspect of things. But there is a cap to church growth under my leadership, unless I bring in somebody who loves people deeply. Right. Who cares for people deeply there. Why? Because I can run an organization where people don't feel seen. And so I think that's where, just as a church, we have to understand the body of Christ is filled with many people with many different gifts and capabilities. I'm a big APEST guy, right? God called some to be apostles and preachers and evangelists and shepherds and teachers. And not everyone has all of those gifts.
No. Yeah.
In fact, very few people, right, have all of those gifts. A lot of times you have one or two that really shine through there. And so that's where we just have to begin to balance our organization as leaders to say, hey, I'm good at this and you're good at this. Let's come together and do that. And again, if we just circle back to those P's, if we're going to lead that way, we can't prioritize platform, because saying I'm good at this and you're good at this, let's do it together, requires me to share my platform there, right? So it's this evaluation of, hey, what things do we hold to be most important there, and how do we balance all of those things?
Yeah. All right. As we kind of get into wrapping up and all of that, normally on the show here, we talk about when I'm done with this podcast, I'm going to walk away and I can do what physical things better. And I think in the context that we're talking about, it's going to be other church leaders, possibly church planners, church whatever, and they listen to a lot of this and they go, crap, I've got certain things that are jacked up. How do I fix this? Where do I go? How do I realign certain things to be more in tune with what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it begins with prayer there. I love to use the language. It's familiar to you because we use it in our church at the beginning of our service almost every Sunday, of chasing after the heart of God in our lives.
Yeah.
Is just language I've fallen in love with over the years. And for me, what that means is, man, if I am chasing after my own agenda, if I'm chasing after all those things, it's easy for me to get jacked up. But if I just pause and take the time to really begin to pursue what the heart of God looks like in my life, to say, like, God, please, please, please let my will begin to align with yours, right? God, like, I don't know, as a leader, most Sundays or going into most Sundays, the prayer I feel like I most frequently pray is just, God, don't let me get in the way of what you want to do. And again, I think we have to have our priorities in order to earnestly pray that prayer.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to this and you're struggling in ministry or struggling in leadership or church planting or just honestly anything between, my biggest encouragement would just be the thing you can do most to improve your circumstance right now is just to pause and pray and seek after God in that moment and say, God, like, I don't know what to do, but I'm just going to chase after you right now. Or, God, I thought I knew what to do, and it turns out I got it all wrong.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know what to do next. And so I'm just going to just chase after you and seek after you. And God, say, what do you want to do in my life? I'm a simple guy behind the scenes. And so I tend to pray in very simple terms. And one of the prayers I pray so often is when I don't know what to do in a situation is, God, I just pray in this situation, you would make the right decision easy to make and the wrong one incredibly hard to make. And like, that is my, like, I don't know what to do prayer. Like, I got no clue. I can't figure this out at all. Like, I am praying that, like, you would just open a window and close a door here, right? Like, make the right decision for me in this situation easy to make and make me struggle with making the wrong decision.
Yeah.
And I have found that just more often than not, when I pray that prayer and I'm earnestly praying that prayer and not pushing an agenda, what God does is I have peace with one outcome and unrest with another outcome. And that tends to lead me in, like, hey, I think we're being led to do this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a level to where that becomes the preference over all of the other outside knowledge of, well, you should do this because of this.
Yeah.
And it could equal more growth, or it could equal more of this, and blah, 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 blah. And we get so surrounded by all of those, like, ideas of how to do church in our own understanding. And what does the word say? Lean not on your own understanding.
Yeah, I think we get caught up in, right, hey, this strategy grew the church, or, man, these Facebook ads grew the church, or this outreach event grew the church, or our great worship, or our great preaching, or our great teaching grew the church. And, like, none of that's true. God grows the church when he wants to grow the church, right? Like, the only way the church grows is people encounter God there. And so, like, all those other things are tools and they can be useful, right? I'm not knocking any of those other things, but if we begin to prioritize and place all of our value in that, then we get it incredibly wrong.
Yeah, we're kind of, and then what are we really growing?
Yes.
Right. And that's the other thing. Are we growing entertainers, or are we growing actual worshipers and followers?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing is like, the quality and the type of people that, what's really sitting in your pew.
Yeah. And I think, again, just as we circle back to that pace conversation there
Mhm.
and understanding that, one of the hardest things as a leader, I think, to develop in valuing pace is you have to be incredibly disciplined, because at times there are going to be buttons that you can push to grow bigger, to grow faster,
Mm.
but there's a price to be paid. It comes usually at the expense of pace and people there. And so it's the discipline to say, hey, I could do that. And if I do that, we're probably going to grow, but I'm not going to do that right now
Mhm.
because I feel like God's calling me to elevate other things right now. And it's an incredibly hard thing to be that disciplined at times. But I think if we earnestly seek after God, and I'll circle back again to, if we look at the way Jesus conducted his ministry and we begin to make that the model for how we conduct our ministry, we see that there's just this priority there, that there is this spiritual discipline to say, hey, the crowds grow, I go to God. The pressure builds, I go to God.
Mhm.
Time after time after time there. And so sometimes the best move we can make as a leader is not pushing the button that's going to make us grow.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Man, thank you so much for being on
Thanks for having me.
with us today. And I think there's a lot of people probably going to be listening to this, taking like a whole bunch of notes. So hopefully it just increases the views because they have to watch it again and
Yeah.
again, all that kind of good stuff. But thank you guys again for joining us here on Valor and Vision. Again, valor meaning having the courage in the face of adversity so you can go after the vision that God has given you. Make sure that you go after and do that. Take care. God bless. See you guys next time.